Welcome to Growing at the Speed of Trust, a conversation about community, trust, and revitalization. Since 2014, the Insight 2050 initiative has brought together public, private, and nonprofit stakeholders from across the region to build consensus around the idea that we have to change the way we build. To support the next 30 years of population growth and the changes to our region's demographics, we have to change the way we build. Efforts like the Corridor Concept Study have increased multi-sector support for a focused growth approach to development that prioritizes infill, supports density, provides affordable housing options, revitalizes blighted areas, mixes land uses, and advocates for transit-friendly design. As a result, Central Ohio has seen implementable plans and tangible projects that have moved the region closer and towards a more sustainable future. And when we say that, we mean environmentally, fiscally, and socially. First of all, what does that mean in the way of sustainability? And second of all, how do you do that? Stakeholder buy-in, however, doesn't always equal public buy-in or support from the general public. Some community members, an Insight 2050 approach of focused growth makes sense for their particular community for sustainably supporting jobs and housing growth. But for many others, systemic discrimination, valid lived experiences, and complicated perceptions about gentrification have tainted topics like density and revitalization. Community buy-in is an integral part of the Insight 2050 initiatives and can only be gained through trust. And trust takes time, and development shifts happen quickly. This breakout session is intended to be an honest, constructive conversation about the inclusivity of Central Ohio's approach to development and how the region can move forward from a history of structural inequities to a more sustainable future that is truly accessible to every Central Ohioan. My name is Kimberly Sharp, and I am the Senior Director of Development for Central Ohio Transit Authority for CODA. CODA's vision is to move every life forward. And equity, diversity, and inclusion is the main ethos of CODA's business model. I'm very proud to work for CODA, and I'm very happy to be a part of implementing the Link Us Corridors system as CODA partners with MORPC, the City of Columbus, Franklin County, and many others, including the private sector, to move this exciting Central Ohio growth strategy forward. I served 6 years as the Deputy Director for Planning and Development for the City of Westerville, and 8 years before that as the Comprehensive Planning Manager for Flagstaff, Arizona. Yes, I'm a geeky planner. I hold a BS in Architecture from Ohio State University and a Master's of City and Regional Planning from Virginia Commonwealth University. I'd like to introduce our esteemed speakers. I'm extremely honored to be speaking with Sharon Ware today. Sharon is the principal of Soup from a Stone, LLC. This company provides an array of services ranging from customized training and consulting packages for community-based and public sector organizations. Her focus has been connecting platforms between grassroots and hidden figures of community leaders and services. She previously served as the Assistant Director of United Way of Central Ohio Neighborhood Partnership Center, where she oversaw nonprofit training, technical assistance, and capacity building programs devoted to strengthening neighborhoods. Under her leadership, the Neighborhood Leadership Academy provided training for over 300 community change agents. She was co-founder of the Neighborhood Best Practices Conference that provided neighbors, neighborhood leaders, and nonprofits opportunities to share their best collaborative practices. Sharon has a communication and marketing master's and certificates in mediation. She serves as a community area commissioner, member of the Presbyterian Committee on Self-Development of People grant program, and several community advisory teams. Welcome, Sharon. Thank you. We'd also like to welcome Kevin Williams. Kevin is a writer, journalist, and advocate for disenfranchised people in Ohio. Kevin writes primarily about social issues LGBTQ issues, policing, politics, race, housing inequality, wealth inequality, and the effects that political changes have had on everyday Ohioans. His viral post, "I don't love Columbus because I can't participate in it," is a critique of the intersections of accessibility of transport, cost of living, and job opportunities in the state of Ohio. He has been published in many Central Ohio spaces, including Matter News, the Ohio Capital Journal, the Ohio Center for Investigative Journalism, EFA from the Ohio State University with a focus on fine arts. Neighborhood of Cleveland. I don't know if you're a Browns fan or not. Dontavius Giles has dedicated his career to advocacy and leadership. After graduating of mental health and addiction services. In the 2018 election, Dontavius served as political director to Ohio Attorney General candidate Steve Dattelbach. Currently, Dontavius serves as the Chief of Communications at the Franklin County Treasurer's Office and is running to represent House District 25 in the Ohio House of Representatives. Outside of work, Dontavius proudly serves as the chair of the Black Caucus of the Young Democrats of America, founding fellow of the New Leaders Council of Columbus, founder of the Columbus African Council, and serves as an executive committee member for the Franklin County Democratic Party and Ohio Democratic Party. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. We do have some overall questions about growth in the Central Ohio area, and we really need to hear from your perspective how we go about this. I'm going to start off with one question, and please just the three speakers jump in at your will. The 30-year regional data projections indicate about half of Central Ohio's growth will be from people moving from other states, other countries, and from within Ohio to Central Ohio. How do you think this should impact the way public agencies engage community members?
I can go first. First and foremost, I do want to say thank you to you, Kim, for moderating this, and also thank you to Morpsey for inviting me to be on this important conversation. You know, when I think about, the growth that's happening in Columbus, but I would say also Central Ohio in general, it's important from an equity lens that we look at who's coming in and how are we communicating with those communities. Growth can't necessarily happen in an echo chamber. It has to be collaborative. We have to make sure that there are folks all across every spectrum of life at the table. If folks who've lived here all their life, to folks who are coming in, experiencing Columbus for the very first time. And I think to not do that only unfortunately furthers the inequities that we've been seeing in our communities. And so it's important that communities, nonprofit organizations, corporations, public-private partnerships, all invest in honest dialogue with community members to figure out what's unfortunately happening in the communities from a space where we need growth and we need to work on and fix some of these issues and problems, to talking about what can be in the city and what can be in the region, and ensure that we're creating space so that everyone can be at the table. I think that that's kind of just my initial perspective on to answer that question. It's so important. I cannot stress enough how important it is that we can't leave nobody behind. And that if the growth of Columbus is to benefit everybody, then we need to make sure that everybody's at the table.
I would so agree. I think that's so on point. Before we can even talk about the future, we have the opportunity to get it right. If we can start developing, we talk about collaboration, but we haven't sat down to really make sure that not only the individuals who are going to be impacted, but those agencies who are swarming around are on the same page and not doing 15 different surveys and 15 different perspectives. And then the individuals, those communities are left on the outside. And looking at how we try to swallow the whole. There's so many issues that we don't look at our partners of those who are good in those issues, addressing it, but again, being on the same page. If we don't get it right now, then, looking for the future is just, creating greater problems. Columbus is that size that if we wanted to, we could possibly get it right.
I think one of the things I've noticed is that, we have a lot, like you said, a lot of people moving in from all over the place. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to focus on the people who, make a lot, who, make the city pretty, so to speak. I'm originally from Akron, and having moved down here to Columbus, I moved here because there were not a lot of opportunities in the other half of the state. And I suspect that's the case for a lot of people who end up in Central Ohio. So I think, going forward, I think making sure that we're surrounding the people who need it, making sure that we're paying attention, not just to the people who, we can brag about, or, the big movers and shakers who make Central Ohio more attractive to other people, but the people who are moving here because they don't have any other options.
Thank you. There's a lot of pretty big planning efforts going on right now, and I'll talk briefly about one I'm highly involved in. That's the Link Us Corridors implementation. And I'll put a plug in if you go to linkuscolumbus.com. And this is actually a planning effort that's been going on for about 10 years. And that's a high capacity transit system of corridors where the growth is focused, meaning jobs, housing options, social services, food, education is really, there's quite a bit focused along these corridors, so there's easy access to existing infrastructure, including transit and faster transit. So with that, as we're getting started in the implementation phase, my question is what Sharon just said: how do we get everyone on the same page? How do we ensure that these types of projects help build support for future development that will help Central Ohio accommodate central growth? Instead of the sprawling out with lots of houses, how do we really focus where there's opportunities? How do we ensure there's opportunities for all?
I can go again. I do want to put a plug in. Kevin, I need to meet you. I'm just going to say that right now. So I think and we said it's going to be an honest conversation, right? So I'm going to take it there. I think the problem that I feel sometimes gets in the ways that we don't define equity. What does equity really mean for our city, as it relates to development, and who is at the table? I think that those 2 points oftentimes don't get defined enough, and then the people who are at the table oftentimes miss out. There are folks who are missing from the table, and so I think these initiatives are very important to start to shape what can be. But I think even when you're bringing people at the table, when you're having these conversations, what does equity really mean, and are we really asking people what do they want to see? I think that's a really important conversation that tends to get missed out, because folks just say, well, I think I know what equity means. I know what I think the city should look like. But you can have that implicit bias towards people of color, towards people who are lower socioeconomic statuses, or people who necessarily may not even have means of they don't have a car, they don't have a bike. So what else are we doing to create space and equity for them so that they can get to jobs that are high paying, so that they can get to healthcare centers, that they can get their needs met and their mental health, be well for their mental health, like what exactly does equity mean? And I think it's important to start the conversation off there and build a vision that is collaborative of everyone, of all spaces, before we even get out there and start developing, programs, supports, initiatives, because I think oftentimes what happens is we develop these initiatives, they look great in the reports, people start developing, and then boom, we figure out, well, wait, we're missing a lot of people. from this conversation. And then, or people, there's backlash because there are folks saying, my voice wasn't included in the process. And you're now pushing me out my home, or pushing me out my community, or my community's changing, and I didn't even know that this was happening. And so I think it's important, and I feel like I answered the question, but part of the conversation, these are great opportunities that we have to build what is a better Columbus, a better region for all of us, but making sure that we do that work on the front end of who is at the table, making sure that we're not missing anybody, and really defining equity that is in a way that's inclusive of everyone. I think when we do those two things on top of the development, we can really see this region transform for everybody for the better.
I'd like to follow Dontavius. I love what you're saying, but one of the other things that I've been at several tables, people are offered these great opportunities. This is going to happen. And the next thing, residents are saying, well, what's next? And there's all these things are going around the block. So when you talk about trust, and those people who are coming and bringing things to a community have to be on point of what's really going to happen. If they're not going to get infrastructure grants for individual economic development, be upfront with them. But don't say there's, lots of money coming into our community and this is going to happen, and people are again standing there and they're not included. So when organizations or groups say, well, we can't get community engagement, people have been there before and they just had, the trust factor is gone. So there's going to have to be a new understanding of what that trust is, the clarity, and start having small wins instead of coming in with these grandiose, that we are in, show it to the community and have the community engaged in building those wins.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Ms. Ware here. There are so many people. I think there's sometimes a very big disconnect between the people who are running the programs and the people who are in power versus the people who actually need help. And sometimes it's very obvious that there's a disconnect with what these people are going through. You talk about making huge promises, but a lot of those people who need those programs really run on those promises. And when they don't come true, it's more than, say, a professional inconvenience for you, or maybe, a slight disappointment. It's devastating to them. And when you have that, when that happens to people who need things repeatedly, it destroys trust. So, yeah, just to piggyback off of that.
These are very good notes. I probably should not be taking notes while I'm moderating. This is fantastic. I'm going to go, I'm going to go into something specific about development. If it's along corridors or not. Development in Central Ohio needs to be, for sustainability reasons, environmentally, fiscally, socially, we can talk about that more in a minute. Development does need to be a little more dense, a little more intact, a little more closer, easier. So transit's an easier choice. Biking is an easier choice. Walking is an easier choice. But there's a general public aversion to density. And it's a significant barrier to the type of development in Central Ohio, which has been successful in other communities, and it needs to be the right scale. It needs to be the right thing for our community, but particularly in a growing region that's already facing a housing shortage. Concerns about density range from things like parking, classroom sizes, and explicit biases against low-income families. You've heard all of those concerns from community members about more in our neighborhood, whatever that neighborhood is. While this is certainly not unique to our region, density remains a controversial topic in all Central Ohio neighborhoods, no matter if they're urban, suburban, or even rural. Why do you think this is the case? Density, people are averse to density.
I can go. I think if you don't mind, I know you said honest conversation, so let's have one. I think there's a difference between who is bearing the brunt of the risk of diversity versus who's reaping the benefits. There was this article, and I'm going to pull it up. His name was Jay Pitter. He did an article for Azure Magazine, and he talked about the difference between dominant diversity, which is essentially predominantly the white middle class dwellers who, they're the ones who have the walk spaces, the green spaces, the sidewalks, they're the ones that are closer to the business corridor. Those are where the bike lanes are, versus forgotten density. And forgotten density is like folks like shanty towns, factory dormitories, senior homes, tent cities, mobile home parks, shelters, public housing. And what happens is, and I think part of this density conversation gets mixed up, because what we're really talking about is systemic racism and inequity, and how in the dominant densities conversation, that's where we talk about opportunity. But then when we talk about the forgotten density, those are the areas that people just don't want to really have a conversation around. That's what we want to build around, right? And so I don't know if density is the conversation or is the issue necessarily. It's making sure that every single community, when we talk about density, is connected to the opportunities, related to jobs, access to, green spaces. Everyone wants to have that. But when we're cutting the city up and saying, well, these communities are going to get the services, the access to these, these opportunities, right? These parks, the dog parks, and all the things that I think happens in more white dominated areas. And whereas the Black communities, when we talk about density, we're talking about, apartment complexes and, and public housing. We're missing the boat here. The conversation already is jumping off in a way that's inequitable, right? And so when we say density, what are we really saying, right? Because we can't have two definitions of density. We got to have density that's equitable for everybody, that everyone has access to all these beautiful opportunities that the city offers. And it kind of goes into what Kevin talked about in his article about, this tale of two cities, right? And about how are we really addressing the inequity as we're looking at growth. And so I'll stop there, but that's because I know that Sharon and Kevin are going to jump in, but I think that's the problem. It's not necessarily density, is that we have defined density in two different ways, depending upon if you're Black and brown versus if you're white and affluent. So that's kind of what I believe is part of the problem.
And I agree. I agree. Again, it's the intention, those leaders that come to the table and say, well, this is what you're going to have, or you can have the opportunity to have. They've already made the decision for those environments. I like that perspective. Yeah.
I'd even take it a little bit further, just talking about, just some of the more granular examples of what density looks like for different people. On one hand, as you guys said before, you have these very, very pretty apartment complexes that are, nice and gorgeous, but who can afford that? Like the people who need to be in these dense areas, they can't afford that. That's unattainable to them. Like why even bring it up to them? Versus, some of the more dense places that they can afford are barely livable. And you can see why there would be so much animosity about density, because as much as we would like to say that there aren't two definitions of density, there really are. You either have, like I said, you either have something that's very beautiful, very nice, but very expensive, or you have something that is unlivable. So when you see that in your communities all the time, I can't help but understand why people have so much animosity towards, more dense housing or density in the city of Columbus, because historically, what have they gotten? they really haven't gotten much. They've only gotten one of those two definitions.
So when key decision makers, policy makers get together and want to meet with the community members to really understand and engage, what is a key thing that you feel is really missing? Because those efforts are made, but it does seem like sometimes the mark or the end goal of true engagement is missed. Is there something, a piece of advice you can give on what is missing from those conversations, or what conversations are missing?
I think there's a sense of lost history in which a group will come into a community, offering the opportunities, not realizing that this has been done before. So are they going to start building? This is not a quick fix. This is not, you could offer $1 million to everyone, I believe, and this is my own personal feeling, to everyone in the community. And if you have not engaged in some type of relationship building, and that you're willing to walk that walk, not just come in and roll the money out and then leave, then their engagement they won't trust the future that they may have, and could really honor the thought that they are empowered to build their community.
And Chair makes a great point. One of the things, as a future legislator, I'll be at the table helping to build policy related to housing and development in State House. And one of the interesting things I think about all the time is redlining, and how redlining has continually permeated in generations of families in this city. And what, as a legislator, can I do about it? And I think about, are there incentives for housing? Is there incentives for educational dollars? Like, what can we do to right the wrong? Because here is, I think, what is, the trust factor that you talked about earlier. There are communities who've been, I live in King Lincoln district, or the Brownsville area of Columbus. I can't buy a house without having to pay over $350,000. And I think about that community, rich with beautiful culture and tradition. And yet, when I look at the housing market and how many people are being pushed out, they're being pushed out because their property taxes are going up. These are families who've lived there all their lives, 30, 40, 50 years. And they paid off their home, and yet their property taxes continually climb. And then the housing next door, it was sold for $39,000, and then it was resold for $380,000. That is what people are fearful of. That's the reality that folks in communities all across this city are experiencing. And what is happening, I feel, in terms of what can be done is, I think we need some cultural humility. I think we need to really recognize what has happened in many of these neighborhoods. And when we talk about development, this is the same type of policies that created redlining, right? These are the same conversations that grandmothers and grandfathers had with their children about why they couldn't sell their home because the bank wouldn't give them any, because they were not going to buy a home in this area because the bank wouldn't give them any money. And now you're talking about development, right? It's like, well, are you going to develop me out of this process? How am I included in these conversations? And so my advice to anyone trying to create development or spurring this conversation of, we need to really think innovatively about bringing people to the table is really having, to Sharon's point, a historical understanding of what has happened in that community. Because redlining is not something that's happened and we've gone away from it. It's still, that issue still is hurting families to this day. And the perceptions of what is considered a good neighborhood versus what is considered an investment neighborhood, we still utilize these historical, unfortunate racist narratives that unfortunately benefit predominantly white communities versus at the harm of Black and brown communities or marginalized communities. And so I think part of the conversation, again, it gets back to what does equity really mean? Who's at the table? And how are you really understanding the cultural, historical significance of what's been done to those neighborhoods? And how are you going to be different? Because if we're not going to be different, if we're going to develop, push folks out, or unfortunately, unfortunately the consequence of pushing people out, then you're no different than what happened before.
I think for me, one of the things I think is very important is to have people who have lived that sort of lifestyle and in with making these decisions. Because, people understand when they're being lied to, and they understand, they can feel when you talk to them about their concerns and you don't get it. They don't get it. And I think once again, just being honest, just listening to people, figuring out, having people who are making these decisions who actually really understand the depth of what they're doing. Because I think that's what happens with a lot of things. I think a lot of times people get excited or they get caught up, or they understand, they feel, how can I put it? They get caught up with a very new idea or something good that's coming. Everybody gets excited and it fails. Like the idea or the something that's supposed to help poor people just fails. And it hurts. But once again, I think just having people who understand the seriousness and the depth of what they're getting into, I think really would go a long way.
Thank you. Some of the things I'm definitely understanding here, that besides consistent and absolute honest communication about possibilities and the why and the how, is really understanding the community, the history, the positives, the negatives, the champions, those who have been trying and just still can't get ahead, and why. And building those relationships early before some big exciting idea about what could happen. There's a lot of homework to do to understand what the possible intended and definitely possible unintended consequences could be. And as part of an entity that builds infrastructure, when I say infrastructure, it could be a water line, a new sewer line, a sidewalk. I'm talking transit. That's infrastructure for a community. Before we plow into that, it's really trying to understand what changes it could mean and listening to the community on what it should mean. So going with a lot of the really meaningful things you're sharing with us, can public agencies in Central Ohio build trust, accountability, and infrastructure simultaneously?
That's a lot in the question, right? Trust 100%. I do think that there are agencies in our communities that are connected or that have the pulse of the community in their heart, their soul, their infrastructure, and the community knows that they do. I think it gets complicated when you talk about implementation because, when we think about development, part of, and I always think about it through the lens of, minority contracting, right? So who, when we talk about development of, like, for example, Key Lincoln or North Linden or South Linden, right? I know that there's a couple of folks I saw, Mayor Beckety on for Reynoldsburg. When we think about, when we're developing the area, one, who's in that area? Are you contracting, or have we even done analyzed, is there job opportunities that these community residents can partake in the implementation of that development, right? Like, I think that there's obviously you can build trust. And I think part of being intentional about every single step is very, very important. Keeping community members abreast of what's happening, including them in the career opportunities, that are, and even if there aren't people who don't necessarily have the skill set, right? What are we doing to develop the skill sets in those areas, right? Because ultimately what we want is we want these families to be a part of the changes that are happening in their neighborhood. And so I think to do all of that is I think it can be done, is very, very hard. I would say partly because of the fact that I think, you can build trust and then you can miss out on the implementation side, or you can build trust and then you really don't have, like, we're not always communicating with our neighborhood about the development that's happening. So it's really interesting. I think each one should be its own category. And you have to assess yourself in each category competently, and whether or not you really are kind of addressing or utilizing strategies to maintain trust, to make sure people implement it or are part of the process, and you're actually developing a neighborhood where everyone is included in its success. All of those there's so many different strategies for each one. I don't know if you can just use trust and then every single one will fall into place.
It is a perfect storm of complexity on how to maneuver all that. But we live in a great time that we can really push this to investigate how we can be accountable through those different levels. To certainly have trust as one of the surrounding goals, but to accomplish each of those layers of addressing issues, it can be done. It's just a new form of understanding a logistical plan of doing that. And, we live in an age that we talk about, we have this incredible communication network. Well, it's kind of gotten out of hand of how it can be effective for everyone. For those of us who are connected to social media, fine. Sometimes we get, just burned out from it. But there's still a whole gully of people who are not tuned into that. And how do we make sure that they receive the information? So are there some, looking, not discarding old patterns, but, how can we upgrade them and be inclusive? So equity is equity in how we get information out and embrace everyone.
I'd also have to add, I think right now people are very much open to something new. COVID-19 has really wreaked havoc on a lot of people. There are more people than ever disenfranchised, some who had never been disenfranchised or poor this way and ever before. And I think if we start having the right conversations now, I think we can really be in a good spot. We can really build a lot of trust and a lot of power for the future.
Kevin, we're going to stick with you for just a minute. Your article from earlier this year, you wrote about trying to find a place to live in a city that does not want me here, in reference to housing and job access. What do you see as essential characteristics for developing a city that shows people, particularly those marginalized because of their race, orientation, disability, or age, that they are wanted?
I've done a bit of writing talking a lot about, very token spaces of inclusion, which people can't eat that. I think for me and a lot of other marginalized people, at the end of the day, we want to be able to eat. We want to be able to live our homes with dignity. We want to be able to do things and have a real life. And for a lot of places in Columbus, and a lot of places, honestly, in the United States, that's not possible. The way jobs work, or the way the money that people make versus the cost of living are not the same. They don't even remotely true up to each other. And when you see stuff like that every day, it's demoralizing. How can you walk past, let's say the Short North or Italian Village, and see all these gorgeous, bars and coffee shops and places to frequent, but you don't make enough money to go there. And there's very little job opportunities decent, well-paying jobs that would give you enough disposable income to do that. No matter about redlining or any other sort of other structural racism or inequalities in the city, I mean, that's just true for anybody of any race or creed. If they're not making enough money, if there's not enough opportunities for them, then that's I think one of the biggest problems I think Central Ohio faces.
Income inequality
Yeah.
and opportunities.
Yeah, I'd say income inequality and everything else follows suit.
Mhm. Thank you.
Can I add something? And I know Kevin, I remember when you wrote that article and I read it, and somebody shared it with me. I was like, oh my goodness, this is literally where I was back in 2010. And some people are unfortunately still experiencing this. I remember coming down from Cleveland, right? I was making about $18,000 a year. And it was hard to even find a place to live. And luckily, I had a roommate and we split the cost, but we were eating ramen every night, right? And I thought I was, again, coming from Cleveland, my family came from a single parent household, experienced a lot of traumatic realities growing up. And I thought 18,000 was something, but at the end of the day, I was like, wait, I can't even, all my friends are going to, go get a drink at Starbucks. Man, Starbucks drink was like $5. I can't pay. I don't have that money. And so I understand, like, it is definitely demoralizing to exist and that was back in 2010. Where we are today is totally different. Everything's more expensive now. So I can't even imagine a young kid trying to make it and what's around them they don't have access to. And you also see that with a number of folks who have now gone to the churches the food pantries to try to get free food. And I remember I think it was Pastor Michael Young just had a food delivery giveaway, and he had cars almost a mile long trying to get necessities for their family. Like this, I'll tell you, this stuff is real and it's visceral for a lot of people. And I think folks who are making policy decisions, and I'll put myself in that space because at some point I will be there, we need to recognize the realities that families are facing in Columbus right now. And while development is an important conversation to have, if we're not including the realities of people who are living here today in that conversation of development, we're literally erasing them from the conversation and from existence. And I think if we're going to be honest about what this city can be, it is important that we include all our communities, all our people in those conversations. So I do appreciate you, Kevin, for bringing that to bear, because it really illuminates what so many people in this city are experiencing and what we need to do from a political, from a policy, from a communal level to really impact change for those families for the better.
Right. Right. Just to follow along with that, I think when I originally wrote the piece, I had a lot of encouragement from people telling me, it's like, it's going to get better for you. Things will get better. You're going to get a job, this, that, and the other. And although I personally was like flattered that people would say that, I think we all need to realize that for a lot of people, it doesn't. We can't, sometimes people read that article and they only focused on my interpersonal situation. And I think we have to realize that for a lot of people, this is their life. They get stuck in this ugly cycle of almost making enough, of almost being able to have a nice place to live, of almost having dignity, And I think going forward, when we're making policies, when we're developing, we have to keep those people in mind. And I think that's one of the most important things. I think that's something that continually misses, not only from Columbus, but I think from a lot of development conversations all over the country.
And I think we'd be remiss in thinking we're having a discussion about development without noting that we're in the middle of a global pandemic in which a lot of these situations are exacerbated. And people's tenuous job situations may be even more tenuous, where they have to switch to a lower paying job. I know at CODA, we're actually watching the job market very closely because we want to provide transit to where it's needed the most. We want to get people to work. I know when I get on early in the morning, people are getting on with their Starbucks uniforms, with their hard hats, in their scrubs. They're going to work. People are going to work, and they're using transit to get there, even in the middle of a global pandemic. But it's not easy. The job market is growing in the logistics and warehouse, and we're watching where the jobs are growing or watching where the jobs aren't growing. And it's all very interesting. It's all very telling of a community and what opportunities are available. So we have about 10, 15 minutes left. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate being a part of this discussion. I realize I'm a part of a wonderful company that is a part of the community very much so. And I'm also part of a pretty big project that has the possibilities of going one way or another. And I truly hope as a community, as a true community, we come together to understand what direction it should go and how it can be done the right way to really make these opportunities available for everybody. And I have a lot to learn, and I want to understand, and I think there's a lot of us that want to make sure we're building infrastructure the right way. So I'd like for your final advice. And I know there's a lot of geeky planners on here, but there's a lot of other normal non-geeky planners. And I do want to note that people are posting some very good comments in the chat box regarding some books or articles that seem to address a lot of these issues we're talking about. I thank everyone for their input. See Dr. Miller on there. But with Kevin and Sharon and Dontavius, please, what advice do you have for transportation, development, and sustainability professionals in the audience today who want to build lasting trust with communities in Central Ohio?
I can go. First, I do want to say again, thank you to Morpsey and to you, Kim, for moderating this panel. I think it's important that we have these difficult conversations. And to be quite frank with you, these can't happen in a vacuum. These conversations have to happen all the time. As I like to say, equity is not a destination. It is literally a journey. And we should incorporate equity in all of the work as things are changing, as our landscape is changing around us. The one thing I will say, and I think is so important, and maybe it's, I'm not a architect or a developer, but I will say that it's important to start development conversations with the least of us and really think about, because oftentimes what happens is we think about, who can pay for these homes, who can buy these apartments, who has the money to go to a Costco or to experience the development that we're trying to build. And I think it's important that we start on the other end and say, we have community members who don't have the resources. How do we make sure that they live in a healthy, a expansive, a truly opportunity city, right? Like, what does that even look like? Like, I think about, and I just had a conversation with some folks about Amazon, right? And how Amazon has all these distribution centers. And then one of the person said, I don't even think we have buses that go to the Amazon distribution sites. I was like, well, that's interesting. I'm gonna talk to Coda about that. But it's just like, when I think about, how are we creating opportunity for the least of us? And that has to be at the beginning of these conversations. We're going to get to the point where folks who have access, they're always going to have access. They're always going to have access. But it's those folks that we are leaving behind who we unfortunately pile on, and unfortunately they get to a point where they can't access anything. They're not connected to a grocery store within where they live. They're not connected to a job line or a bus line. They don't have sidewalks. They don't have green space, right? They live in an area where it's considered undeveloped. Like, you can't even develop in those areas, right? We have to change our conversations. And I think it's important. It's hard to do because I think we're kind of, unfortunately, maybe stuck in the space, but we need champions to say, no, we have to really think critically about places in Columbus that don't get love, that we don't look at as potential areas of development. And we have to grow there. We have to build there. And we have to incorporate our communities and those people living in those communities as part of the process. It is so important. And I think, unfortunately, if we don't, we're just going to continually make people invisible and going to erase them. And if we're tired of it, I know I'm tired of it. We have to do something different, and really building for the least of us has to be at the beginning part of the conversation. So thank you for having me.
Kim, I would like to thank you and Mortsy as well as this opportunity. So from my perspective as a community person, and I'm going to go back to that word of trust, it's actually walking in the neighborhoods, finding those leaders and walking with them and talking to the community. Old-fashioned, but that is how you're going to kind of get the feeling, not from absolutely surveys are necessary and that kind of thing many times, but for that real feeling to stand in a neighborhood and turn around and say, where's the closest grocery store? Where do I go? Where's the fire department in relationship to this area? And where is the bus stop? I mean, I am very fortunate. Where I live, I have access to 2 bus lines to get me around. But when you start going to further areas in Columbus, that isn't, viable. And if you're working in far out regions, then you're really up a creek. So therefore, you're really going to have to find maybe that one community person that you start becoming partners and building that trust.
I'd also like to thank you, Kim and Morpsy, for having me. Similar to Dontavia's, I think boosting up those who actually need it, these resources. Not to pick on the short north again, but I know there's always this proposal that gets floated around on social media about having light rail. But if you look at the light rail lines that they want to make, it's never really for the people who need it. It's always up and down High Street so people can bar hop. And now, I mean, I personally would like that. That would be cute. That'd be fun. But is that really functional for the people who need it? Does that really work for, the people who are out and, working on the South Side and going out to Etna or Groveport to an Amazon fulfillment center, or, working at Rickenbacker Airport? How do they get back and forth? How do they get around? Where do they live? Why aren't we boosting them up? It's interesting to see how many people in Columbus or Central Ohio that don't think that think the city stops south of 104, and it doesn't go any place further north than North Broadway. I mean, there's so much more city here. There's so many more people here, and the people who have been disenfranchised, they feel it. They know when they're not being focused on. So I think just going forward, even just making sure that these people's problems are visible, I think really goes a long way.
Thank you. Kevin, Sharon, and Dontavius. I look forward to seeing Representative Jarrell's. This has been enlightening for a lot of people, and it definitely is something that's, it's a heart conversation. It's more of a heart conversation than a mind conversation, but it's definitely for the mind. And I really do appreciate it very much. I'm looking forward to the work before us. I'm looking forward to having a relationship with each of you and talking with you afterwards and trying to incorporate a lot of things we're discussing. And I wish we could take a few questions online, but I don't think we're doing that. Toby said this, we're going to end it this. We're looking forward to the Summit on Sustainability, these 2 days. This is the first day into it. MORPC hosts this every year. I truly appreciate it. I'm going to go back to one of our original statements, sustainability. We talked about environmental sustainability, fiscal sustainability, and social sustainability. For a region, for the Central Ohio region to be socially sustainable, that's truly what we're addressing today. But all three of those, of course, we know lead into each other and help each other. But a socially sustainable community, a fiscally sustainable community for the long term is also very healthy socially, because it is about opportunities for all. And I don't know of any cities that has it all together correct, but some cities do it better than others. And I think it's an awareness, and it's a community building, and it's an understanding of the jobs and the market and equalities. It's about opportunities and connections. And for that, I really appreciate it. We are going to talk more soon. With that, I want to thank everybody for their time. Do we have any final comments before we sign off? And I really do appreciate you being part of this today.